After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralysed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool, and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the water, was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple, and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together from John chapter 5. Here we have another incident in the life of Jesus, and John's going to follow this up with a major discussion on the fact that Jesus is the judge of all the earth, and he in fact is the one who gives life. And that is foreshadowed here in that the Jews are judging Jesus, and Jesus has granted life to this man who had been paralysed with an infirmity for 38 years. The chronology of the life of Jesus differs slightly between the various Gospels. John specifically identifies 3 Passovers: a Passover immediately after the calling of the first apostles, a Passover just before the feeding of the 5,000 in the next chapter, and the Passover when Jesus was crucified. So his public ministry lasted at least 2 years, but based on the information in the other Gospels, most commentators think it lasted 3 years. In any case, as John presents the story, Jesus' theology did not develop over time, as we saw when we read John chapter 3. It was fully developed when he first came to Judea with his disciples, and that in that first season he was making more disciples. John the Baptist was. John had done a great preparation, but when John was saying, "I'm not the Messiah, Jesus is the Messiah," then many people switched from following John to the one that John pointed to, that is Jesus. But when Jesus had seen that happening, he withdrew from Judea, the reason being that he knew the public expectation of what the Messiah would do was not in line with what the Scriptures said was to happen next. And so, to avoid the community taking precipitous action, he had withdrawn to Galilee. But now we find he is coming back to Jerusalem for one of the feasts of the Jews. This was his general pattern, that he came up to Jerusalem for Passover, for Pentecost, for the Feast of Tabernacles, and for the Feast of Dedication. There are at least 4 times a year that Jesus would come up to Jerusalem. Now, we're not told what the occasion was here, simply that it was a feast of the Jews that Jesus went up. It could well have been Tabernacles, because the weather is not too severe at that time, being autumn, and it was a period of hope and anticipation, which would explain why so many people were at the pool. And at this particular visit, it was over a year out from the crucifixion, the opposition to him had not cemented to the degree that he was not able to freely move. We're then told that near the sheep gate, which was not far from the temple because the sheep were brought into the temple via the temple courtyard via the sheep gate, there is a pool called, in Hebrew, Bethesda. This pool is north of the temple, enclosed in the current Jerusalem Old City walls, but in Jesus' time was outside the city walls, not far from the Roman fortress. The name Bethesda means house of mercy. The pool of Bethesda was a double pool surrounded by colonnades on 4 sides, with a 5th colonnade standing on the dividing wall which separated the northern and southern pools. The 5 porches were in the colonnades on the 2 sides, with 2 at each end and 1 in the middle, so that there was some shelter for people who were there. And in these porches a very large number of sick people were gathered, blind people, lame people, paralysed people, and they had a particular object in being there. John explains an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the water, was made well of whatever disease he had. This was a place of last resort, when their condition was such that doctors could not do anything about it. The blind, the lame, the paralysed, and those who were extremely sick, they just had to wait and hope that they had an opportunity to get into the water when it was stirred. The subject of our story had evidently been there for some considerable time and had witnessed others being healed. He had had his infirmity for 38 years, a long time, and yet he still had hope that he would be healed. Jesus came to this place. He knew that there were many people there, and he looked at those people, and I guess in one sense he looked sadly at them, because he knew their condition and the sadness of their circumstances. He was the one who could give life, but they were not looking to him, they were looking to the water. It amazes me that in this situation he didn't ignore them as we would have to. It would be a spectacle to us, and we would go away and maybe go and try and find someone who had been healed. But Jesus surveyed the crowd and chose one person out of that crowd and asked him simply, "Do you want to be made well?" This question might surprise us. We might think, well, obviously the person wants to be made well. But Jesus requires us to articulate our desire. So he gives him the choice. Do you want to be made well? And the sick man said, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." This is the evidence that people were being healed in this place. He has witnessed others stepping into the water and being healed. But he doesn't have anyone to help him, and so he's not been fast enough to be the one who was healed. So he's answered the question by indicating, yes, he does. He's been trying to get into the water for a long time. Jesus says to him then, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked.